The blast hit Bay 4 before anyone screamed. Two explosions, 30 seconds apart, tore through the trauma wing of Harlow Valley Medical Center in Dustin Creek, Arizona, and the ceiling came down in sheets of fire and fractured drywall. Monitors blew off the walls. Oxygen lines ignited. 3 nurses dropped to the floor before the second shockwave passed. Every doctor on the floor froze where they stood, backs against whatever surface was still standing. Every doctor except one person who wasn't a doctor at all. Abigail Marsh, a quiet ER nurse with sun-bleached hair and a reputation for being too slow, too timid, and too unremarkable to matter, moved to the locked emergency cabinet at the end of the hall, entered a 6-digit code she had memorized 4 months ago, and pulled out a rifle. She checked the chamber. She checked the barrel. She did it with both hands steady and her breathing completely controlled. She didn't look scared. She looked like she was running a checklist she had run 1,000 times before. Nobody on that floor had ever seen her look like that. Nobody on that floor had any idea who she actually was. Before you follow what happens next, if you've never seen this channel before, hit subscribe right now because this is the kind of story we tell here. The ones where the most overlooked person in the room turns out to be the only one who can hold everything together. Don't miss what's coming in the next parts. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Dustin Creek because the worst is just beginning. Abigail had been at Harlow Valley Medical Center for 11 months. She had transferred from somewhere out of state, no one knew exactly where, carrying a nursing license, a single reference letter, and almost no personal history that anyone could verify. The hospital had been short-staffed in the ER and desperate enough to ask fewer questions than they should have. She had taken the job and kept her head down. In the beginning, people had simply ignored her. That was fine. She knew how to be invisible, had spent years practicing it, and the ER during a normal week gave her plenty of room to work quietly without drawing attention. She was competent, more than competent, though she was careful never to let that show too obviously. She triaged fast. She never lost a line. She could read a deteriorating patient 20 minutes before the monitors confirmed it, and she had developed a habit of quietly repositioning supplies and updating protocols in ways that looked like housekeeping but were actually preparation. The problem was Dr. Marcus Vell. Vell was the chief of surgery at Harlow Valley, and he was the kind of man who had confused confidence with authority so long ago that he no longer knew the difference. He was good at what he did, technically skilled, fast in the OR, the kind of surgeon who could close a chest wound clean and calm under pressure. He was also petty in the specific grinding way that only people with institutional power can afford to be. He needed everyone below him to stay below him, not because it made the hospital function better, but because it made him feel like the room was organized correctly. Abigail was below him. She was a nurse. As far as Vell was concerned, that was the end of the conversation. The first time he corrected her in public, she had been in the middle of adjusting a septic patient's fluid rate ahead of the attending's order. She'd seen the early signs, the subtle drop in urine output, the slight fever creep, the particular look of a patient whose pressure was about to go sideways, and she'd acted. She was right. The attending confirmed it 4 minutes later. Vell, who had been passing the room and saw her adjusting the IV without a direct order, stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that has moved on its own. Did someone authorize that change? I flagged it with the attending, Dr. Vell. She confirmed. I didn't ask what you flagged. I asked who authorized the change. Dr. Nora Solis. She's on her way to co-sign. He had looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether the situation required a more formal response. Then he'd said, "You're just a nurse. You don't adjust drips ahead of orders. That's not your lane," and walked away. She hadn't argued. She'd noted it, filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, and continued adjusting the drip. Over the following months, the pattern repeated itself. Vell would walk past her during rounds and make a comment about her charting being slow. He'd call her by the wrong name in front of residents. Not accidentally, but pointedly, the way people use small erasures as a form of control. He told the charge nurse once, loudly enough for half the floor to hear, that Abigail was not performing at the level this department requires, and that if things didn't change, he'd be recommending a formal review. The charge nurse, a practical woman named Tamsin Doyle, who had seen this particular dynamic play out before, had nodded and said nothing, and later told Abigail privately that Vel said that about someone new every 6 months, and it rarely led anywhere. It didn't stop the other nurses from keeping a cautious distance. It didn't stop the residents from smirking sometimes when Vel dismissed her in public. Social ecosystems in hospitals are delicate and hierarchical, and when the top of the hierarchy marks someone as marginal, the rest of the system tends to adjust accordingly. Abigail ate her lunch alone. She worked her shifts. She went home to an apartment that had furniture but not much else. She never argued. She never complained. She simply kept doing the work. But 3 months before the explosion, something had changed. Not in her behavior, which stayed exactly the same, but in her attention. She started staying late in ways that looked like overtime paperwork but weren't. She walked the hospital's lower corridors more than her job required, taking routes that didn't make efficient sense. She spent time in the equipment rooms, the utility corridors, the backup stairwells that the staff used only during drills. She updated the ICU's emergency supply cabinet twice in a single month, which confused the charge nurse but didn't raise any formal concerns. She quietly cross-checked the external security contractor's rotation logs against the facility's badge access records, and she found a 17-minute gap on 3 separate Tuesdays that shouldn't have existed. She didn't tell anyone about the gap. She did add a second set of trauma supplies to the locked cabinet at the end of the hall, using the discretionary medical budget that every senior floor nurse had access to and almost no one ever used. She also changed the cabinet's code without filing the update through the normal administrative channel, a minor procedural violation that no one noticed, because no one was paying attention to what Abigail Marsh did with supply cabinets. 3 weeks before the attack, she had a conversation with Vel that set the tone for everything that followed. She had been reviewing the ICU's disaster protocol documentation, a binder that was technically required by state compliance rules and practically never touched, and she had found significant gaps. 3 of the ventilator patients on the unit were on settings that would require manual support within 6 minutes of a power interruption. The backup generator sequence had a documented lag of 4 minutes and 20 seconds. That gap, roughly 1 minute and 40 seconds during which those 3 patients had no automated support, was not addressed anywhere in the current protocol. She had written a 2-page summary and brought it to the department safety meeting. Vel had been there. He'd let her finish. Then he'd said, "Marsh, the generator system passed its last 2 inspections. I'm not authorizing protocol rewrites based on a nurse's weekend reading project." "The lag is documented in the maintenance log, Dr. Vel. I can pull the records if—" "I don't need you to pull records. I need you to focus on your actual responsibilities." He had looked around the table, including the other attendings, and the hospital administrator, in a shared moment of mild amusement. "Is there anything else from nursing?" There was a small, tight silence. She had said, "No," and sat back down. That evening, she had returned to the ICU, quietly repositioned the 3 ventilator patients to rooms with independent battery backup units, and updated the manual support protocol herself, distributing it to the nurses on her unit with a note that called it a training refresh. Tamsin Doyle had read it, looked at Abigail across the nursing station, and said, "This isn't how we submit protocol changes." "I know," Abigail said, "but it's how we keep those 3 patients alive if the power drops." Tamsin had looked at her for a moment that was longer than usual. Then she'd filed the document in the unit binder without another word. 1 week before the attack, Vel called Abigail into his office. He didn't offer her a seat. "I've been looking at your file," he said. He had a folder open on his desk that she recognized as HR documentation. "There are gaps in your employment history. Your reference letters are thin. Your background check came back clean, but the clinical evaluations from your prior hospital are vague. They're accurate. They're evasive." He leaned back. "I don't know what your situation is, and I'm not asking. What I'm telling you is that I've been patient with a level of performance that doesn't meet this department's standard, and I'm reaching the end of that patience. You've got 60 days to show measurable improvement, or I'm initiating a formal separation process." She looked at him steadily. "Is this documented?" "It will be." "Then I'd like a copy of whatever performance metrics you're using as a benchmark, so I can address them specifically." He blinked. That was not the response he had expected. People Vel put in this chair usually either got defensive or got small. Abigail Marsh did neither. She just asked for documentation, with the flat, practical tone of someone who had sat through much harder conversations than this one. "I'll have HR send it," he said. after a pause that was slightly too long. "Thank you," she said, and left. She went back to the floor, clocked into her shift, and spent the next 4 hours triaging a car accident, a pediatric asthma case, and one elderly man with a suspected pulmonary embolism that she caught before his oxygen saturation had dropped far enough to trigger the monitor alarm. 7 days later, the hospital came apart. The first explosion happened at 7:22 in the morning during shift change. The timing wasn't accidental. Shift change was the moment of maximum confusion, when outgoing and incoming staff overlapped, when attention was split, when the people who knew the most about the floor's current state were in the middle of handing off to people who were still catching up. Whoever had planned this knew how hospitals worked. The blast originated in a maintenance corridor adjacent to the trauma bay, a corridor that should have been locked but wasn't, because the external security contractor's rotation had that unexplained 17-minute gap on Tuesdays, and today was Tuesday. The explosion tore through the wall between the maintenance corridor and the trauma bay, blowing out 3 trauma rooms and igniting the oxygen supply line that ran along the west wall. Glass came down. The ceiling tile collapsed in a section roughly 40 feet long. 4 patients in the trauma bay were knocked from their beds by the pressure wave. 2 nurses were cut by flying glass. A resident who had been standing near the window was thrown against the opposite wall and didn't get up. Then, 31 seconds later, the second explosion. This one was smaller, a shape charge positioned to block the primary stairwell exit on the east side of the building. But it was precisely placed. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to contain, to funnel, to cut off one of the 2 main routes out of the hospital's upper floors. Abigail was at the nursing station on the 3rd floor when the first blast hit. The building shook hard enough to knock monitors off their mounting brackets and send a rolling medication cart sideways into the wall. The overhead lights flickered and dropped to emergency power. She was already moving before the second explosion went off. She went directly to the window at the end of the hall. From 3 floors up, she could see the parking structure to the south and the service road that ran along the hospital's east perimeter. There were 3 vehicles on the service road that had not been there at the start of her shift: a black panel van, a white SUV, and a second van further back. None of them were marked. None of them were moving. They were positioned in a pattern that she recognized, that she had been trained to recognize in a different life a long time ago, as an exterior containment formation. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a gas line failure or a structural problem. This was a coordinated assault on a building with patients inside it. She pulled out her personal phone, not the hospital's communication system, and sent a single text message to a number she had memorized and never entered into her contacts. The message was 4 words. Then she put the phone back in her pocket, went to the locked cabinet at the end of the hall, entered the 6-digit code, and pulled out the rifle. Tamsin Doyle was 3 steps behind her and stopped cold when she saw it. "Abigail, what is that?" "A precaution I put in place 6 weeks ago." She checked the chamber. She checked the barrel. Her hands were steady. "I need you to listen carefully, Tamsin. I need the ICU sealed, the door at the end of the corridor, the one that connects to the service wing. I need that barricaded with a crash cart and a medication dispensing unit. Not locked, barricaded. There's an active fire situation. It's not a fire situation." She looked at Tamsin directly. "There are armed people in this building. They came through the maintenance corridor on the east side. The stairwell exit is blocked. That second explosion was a containment charge, not structural damage. They're going to move toward patient areas because that's how they control the building." Tamsin stared at her. "How do you know that?" It wasn't really a question. It was a statement shaped like a question. "Because I've seen it before." Abigail pulled the strap over her shoulder and moved to the corner of the hallway, positioning herself with a sight line down the main corridor and the secondary access point. "Get the ICU sealed. Move the ambulatory patients to the interior room, the one with no exterior windows. Call the on-call administrator and tell her to initiate lockdown protocol right now. And when she says there's no protocol for this, tell her to lock every external door from the inside and stop using the radio system. Stop using. Their frequencies are likely monitored. Use landlines only. Go." Tamsin went. Abigail had never heard Tamsin move that fast before. 30 seconds later, the door at the far end of the corridor opened. 2 men came through it. They were wearing tactical gear, not police, not hospital security, and carrying weapons with the kind of deliberate positioning that meant they had done this before. They were moving quickly, systematically, checking rooms as they went, which meant they were looking for something specific and they knew the layout. That last part landed hard. They knew the layout. Someone had given it to them. Abigail pressed against the corner. She let them clear 2 rooms. She waited until they were in the narrow section of the corridor where the sight angles were worst for them and best for her. She had 2 seconds, maybe 3. She used them. The first man went down with a controlled shot that would not kill him. She had placed it precisely, at the shoulder joint, disabling his weapon arm. He hit the floor and stayed there, which was the point. Dead men don't answer questions. The second man spun toward the sound and she was already moving, using the door frame of the supply room as cover, and when he raised his weapon she was no longer where he was aiming. She came around the frame low and fast, and the second shot was placed the same way. Precise, disabling, not lethal. And then there was quiet in the corridor. She moved to them quickly. She stripped their weapons. She zip-tied their wrists using restraints she had taken from the cabinet along with the rifle 6 weeks ago, when she had first noticed the gap in the security rotation. Behind her, a voice. She turned. Dr. Vell was standing at the entrance to the corridor. He had apparently come up from the 2nd floor, maybe following the sound of the shots, maybe looking for an exit, maybe just moving in the direction humans move when they're panicked, which is usually toward noise rather than away from it. He was in his surgical scrubs, his face the color of old concrete, and he was staring at the 2 zip-tied men on the floor and at Abigail standing over them with a rifle across her chest. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Who?" he started. "Get back to surgery," she said. "If you have patients on the table, stay with them. Don't use the radio. Don't go to the east stairwell." "Who are you?" She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Right now, the person keeping you alive." She turned away from him. "Go." He went. It was the first time in 11 months that Marcus Vell had done what she said without an argument, and she didn't have time to notice whether that felt like anything. She moved toward the stairwell access on the west side of the building, where she had a better angle on the ground floor lobby. From the stairwell window, she could see what was happening below. A 3rd team had come through the main entrance, and they were moving the lobby staff toward the interior wall in the same systematic way the men upstairs had been moving. Not panicked, not aggressive, controlled, professional. This was organized. This was rehearsed. She counted 6 visible operatives on the ground floor, estimated 3 to 4 more based on standard formation patterns for a building this size. The 2 she'd taken down on the 3rd floor brought the visible count to 8, which meant there were likely 3 or 4 more that she hadn't located yet. She texted the number again. This time, 2 words. Her phone buzzed once in response. She looked at the message, exhaled through her nose, and moved. She went floor to floor methodically, using the service corridors she had spent 3 months learning, the routes that weren't on the posted maps, the ones she had walked on evenings and early mornings when the hospital was quiet and no one was watching a nurse with no apparent reason to be in a utility corridor. She cut off 2 more operatives before they reached the pediatric ward. She directed a group of stranded surgical residents to a safe room she had identified weeks ago, a storage room with reinforced walls and 2 exits, one of which was not on any current floor plan. The residents were young, shaken, and too scared to ask the questions they would have asked under any other circumstance. They went where she told them without argument. She was back on the 3rd floor, near the ICU, when she heard the helicopters. Not hospital helicopters, not news helicopters. Military rotorcraft. She knew the sound the way most people know the sound of a familiar car engine from a long time and a lot of exposure. They came in low and fast from the northwest, which meant they hadn't come from Davis-Monthan and hadn't come from Fort Huachuca. They'd been pre-positioned much closer, which meant someone had anticipated this, had resources already in the field, had been waiting. That meant her text had reached someone who had been expecting it. She went to the window and watched 2 Blackhawks circle the building's perimeter, with a 3rd hanging back at high cover. Below, she could see ground vehicles pulling into the hospital's north entrance, marked Federal and unmarked Tactical. She could see the coordinated positioning of a perimeter team that had trained for exactly this kind of environment. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The message was a single letter and a number. She put the phone in her pocket and moved toward the hospital's main communication room on the 2nd floor, a room she had accessed once 3 months ago on a pretext of verifying landline backup connections. but really to confirm that it had a clear line to the building's external PA system. She was 2 steps from the communication room door when Tamsin Doyle found her in the hallway. Tamsin looked at her the way you look at someone when you're discovering that a person you thought you understood has turned out to be something else entirely. Not frightening exactly, but so far outside the boundaries of your existing model that your brain is still running to catch up. "The ICU is sealed," Tamsin said. "All ambulatory patients are in the interior room. The administrator activated lockdown." She paused. "The military is outside." "I know. They're on the radio asking for someone. They're not asking for administration. They're not asking for the hospital director." Tamsin's voice was steady, which Abigail had always respected about her. "They're asking for you." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere below, she could hear the controlled sounds of the military team beginning to move through the building's lower levels. Abigail's face didn't change. "Tell them I'm on my way down," she said. "And Tamsin, the ICU ventilator patients, the 3 on manual backup. They're stable. Keep someone with each of them until the power is fully restored and the automated systems are confirmed running. Not just the monitor check, someone physically present." "I know how to manage my patients," Tamsin said quietly. "I know you do." There was a beat between them, brief, complicated, the kind of beat that happens when 2 people who have been operating at a professional distance suddenly see each other without the usual buffer of institutional role. "Who are you?" Tamsin asked. Not the way Vel had asked it, not as an accusation or a challenge, as a real question from someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Abigail looked at her. She almost said something. She had the shape of it ready, the beginning of a real answer. Then the radio at the end of the hall crackled, and a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years said her name, her real name, the one nobody at Harlow Valley Medical Center had ever seen written down, in the flat, specific cadence of someone who needed a situation report and needed it now. Her expression shifted, barely, just at the edge, and she turned away from Tamsin and walked toward the sound. Below, the military was in the building. Above, 3 patients were breathing on backup batteries. And somewhere in this hospital, there were still operatives who hadn't been located. She had a name that hadn't been used in 4 years, a rifle that wasn't supposed to exist, and a text message from someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She walked toward the stairwell and went down. The stairwell smelled like smoke and concrete dust, and Abigail took the steps fast, rifle angled down, back to the wall at each landing before she turned the corner. The ground floor was different from what she'd seen from above. What had looked like controlled movement through the lobby window was, up close, organized chaos. The kind where people who know what they're doing are trying to contain a situation that is still evolving. 2 soldiers in tactical kit were posted at the main entrance with their backs to the external glass. 3 more were moving down the south corridor in a stack formation, clearing rooms. A federal agent in a dark jacket with no visible agency markings was talking into a headset near the reception desk, and he saw Abigail coming down the last flight of stairs and stopped mid-sentence. I was young, younger than she expected, and he had the particular look of someone who had been briefed on a person and was now reconciling the briefing with the actual human in front of him. She was in hospital scrubs, wearing a rifle like it belonged there, and she had blood on her left sleeve that wasn't hers. He pulled the headset away from his ear. "Marsh?" "Yes." "Agent Decker, Joint Federal Task Force Lohman." He didn't extend his hand, neither did she. "We have a command element setting up in the parking structure. Colonel Harwick is requesting you directly." "How many confirmed operatives inside?" "We had 9 on entry. You took down 4, 2 third floor, 2 near pediatric. We've confirmed 2 more on the ground floor, 1 in custody, 1 still mobile. Best estimate 2 to 3 unaccounted." He was reading off a tablet as he talked, glancing up at intervals. "There's a situation on the 2nd floor that Harwick needs to brief you on." "Tell me now." He looked at her. He was deciding something. 3 of their people made it to the cardiac unit before we got containment in place, he said. "They have staff and 2 patients as a secondary hold position." She absorbed that without showing it on her face. "Layout?" "Cardiac unit is on the 2nd floor, east wing. Single corridor access, 2 room exits at the back that both open to the service stairwell. The stairwell at the back is currently blocked by the containment charge debris from the 2nd explosion. The debris is blockable, not impassable. Someone with tools in 20 minutes could clear it." "We know. That's part of what Harwick wants to discuss. She was already moving toward the east wing. Decker fell into step beside her, and two soldiers who had been near the entrance followed without being asked, which told her something about what Harwick had communicated about her before she came downstairs. She stopped at the base of the east wing corridor and looked at the layout from the corner. The corridor was 110 feet, roughly, with a nursing station two-thirds of the way down and the cardiac unit entrance beyond it. The lights in the east wing were on backup power, set dimmer than normal, with a slight flicker every 40 seconds that she had noticed was tied to the generator's cycling interval. "What's their communication situation?" she asked. "Encrypted short range. We've been intercepting fragments but can't fully decode in the field. There's been no direct contact with the hold team in the last 11 minutes. That's not good." "No. It means they're either waiting for a signal or they've made a decision and stopped needing to communicate." She looked at the ceiling, the ventilation intake above the nursing station, the overhead lighting panels, the sprinkler heads. "Is there any chance the debris in the service stairwell has already been partially cleared?" Decker looked at one of the soldiers. The soldier shook his head. "Our team just checked. It's intact." "Okay," she thought for 2 seconds. "There's a linen transport shaft that runs from the basement to the 3rd floor. It has a lateral access panel on the 2nd floor that opens inside the cardiac unit's supply room, which is at the rear of the unit, separate from the corridor access. I found it 3 months ago when I was doing a facility review." Decker stared at her. "A linen shaft. It's not large, but it connects. If you want a second approach point that doesn't come through the main corridor, that's your option." She paused. "I'd recommend a simultaneous approach, corridor and shaft, timed together. They can't split their attention if both come at once." There was a brief silence. "I need to get Harwick on the line," Decker said. "Do it on the way. We don't have the time to do it standing still." Colonel Reese Harwick was a compact man in his late 40s, with a haircut that had looked military since before Abigail was born, and when she came through the side entrance of the hospital's parking structure to the command vehicle, he looked at her the way people sometimes look at someone they've only seen in photographs, like he was checking the image against the reality and finding the comparison a little unsettling. He had known her, or known of her, for a long time. They had never been in the same room. "Sergeant Marsh," he said. "I'm a nurse now, Colonel. You're whatever this situation needs you to be." He turned to the display board behind him, a digital floor plan of Harlow Valley Medical Center with color-coded position markers. "We're dealing with an organized cell, 11 confirmed on entry. You've neutralized 4, we have 2 in custody, 1 confirmed down from our ground team engagement in the lobby. That leaves 4 unaccounted." He pointed to the cardiac unit marker. 3 are holding position here. The 4th is somewhere in the building and we have not located them." "The 4th is the problem," she said. "Yes. The 3 in the cardiac unit are a distraction. If they wanted those patients dead, they would have done it already. They're holding them because they need to keep your attention directed there, while the 4th does something else." Harwick looked at her steadily. "What do you think the 4th is doing?" "Looking for me." The command vehicle was quiet for a moment. 2 of Harwick's staff, a signals officer and an intelligence analyst who looked barely 25, exchanged a glance. "That's consistent with what we've developed over the last 72 hours, the analyst said. He pulled up a separate display bus, a file with a header that was partially redacted. "The cell has ties to a network that has been tracking a specific extraction target. The attack on Harlow Valley appears to have been structured to create a situation that would force the target to surface." "I know," Abigail said. "The target is me," she said. "I know." Another silence. Harwick said, "When did you know?" "I suspected it when I found the security rotation gap. I confirmed it when I saw the exterior formation. It was configured to contain, not to destroy." If this was about the hospital, the second charge would have been structural, not positional. They weren't trying to bring down the building. They were trying to control who could move through it and how. She looked at the floor plan. "They needed a crisis large enough that I couldn't stay passive. They needed me to pick up a weapon and move, because once I did that, they'd know exactly where I was and what I was capable of, and their 4th operative could track me to a position." Harwick put both hands on the edge of the table and looked at the floor plan for a long moment. "Which means," he said, "that every time you've been moving through this building, the 4th has been trying to get a fix on you. Yes, I've been using the service corridors and keeping my patterns irregular, but they know I'm in the building and they know what I look like. She paused. They also know, or suspect, that I've made contact with your command, which means the window where they still think this can go their way is closing. What happens when that window closes? They default to the contingency plan, which is kill the hostages in the cardiac unit and extract. The signals officer straightened. Harwick looked at her without blinking. How certain? He asked. Certain enough that I'd move in the next 15 minutes. He looked at his watch. Then he looked at Decker, who had followed her into the command vehicle and had been standing near the entrance with the particular stillness of someone listening very hard. What do you need? Harwick asked. She looked at the floor plan again, at the cardiac unit layout, at the linen shaft access point she had marked on her mental map months before she had any idea it would matter. She thought about the 17-minute gap in the security rotation. She thought about the 3 ventilator patients on battery backup upstairs and Tamsin Doyle, who she trusted to watch them. She thought about the 4th operative, somewhere in the building, who had been watching her move. I need someone your team is comfortable losing eyes on for 10 minutes, she said. Someone who can move through the main corridor toward the cardiac unit visibly, enough to pull the 3 inside's attention to the front, and I need the linen shaft access cleared and confirmed passable in the next 8 minutes. The shaft clearance I can do, Harwick said. He looked at Decker. The decoy. You up for it? Decker looked at Abigail. How visible? Visible enough that they think negotiation is starting. Slow movement, hands up at shoulder level, nothing that looks tactical. You're not trying to fool them into thinking you're harmless. You're trying to make them focus on you long enough for me to come through the back. And if they shoot, they won't. Not yet. They need to know if I'm coming, and they're using the hostages to make that happen. If they shoot the first person through the door, they lose their leverage. She looked at him. But wear your vest. Already wearing it, Decker said. The linen shaft was exactly as tight as she remembered from the diagram. It was not designed for a person. It was designed for stacked linen bags and the mechanical carrier system that moved them floor to floor, and navigating it required keeping her arms close and moving in a way that was more controlled fall than climb. She had left the rifle with Harwick's team. In the shaft, she was working with a sidearm, a small medical blade she had taken from a trauma kit, and the layout of the cardiac unit that she had memorized in the same systematic, unannounced way she had memorized everything else about this hospital. She counted her progress by feel and by the faint change in air quality. The shaft pulled air from the building's return system, and each floor had a slightly different smell. The second floor had the antiseptic and stale coffee smell of the cardiac unit. She found the lateral access panel by touch, in the dark, and felt for the manual release that wasn't on any posted diagram, but was a required feature under state code, a small lever recessed into the panel frame. She pressed it. The panel gave inward with a sound like a card being bent, barely audible. She listened. From the supply room side of the panel, she could hear breathing. One person, close, not moving. One of the 3 operatives had been positioned in the supply room, which was smart. It was the only secondary access point in the unit, and anyone who knew the building well enough to find it would expect someone to be there. She had expected someone to be there. She came through the panel fast and low, and the operative in the supply room had been watching the door, the supply room's main door, which faced the corridor, and not the panel in the sidewall. The 2 seconds it took him to process what he was seeing and redirect were the 2 seconds she needed. It was brief and controlled and not clean. He was faster than she had gauged and got a hand on her arm before she had him contained, which meant she had a bruise forming on her forearm before it was over. But he went down without discharging his weapon and without making enough noise to reach the main room. She pressed her back to the supply room wall and listened again. From the main room, a voice, male, low, with an accent she placed as Eastern European, was speaking in short phrases. She heard another voice respond. 2 in the main room. 1 she'd just taken down in the supply room. That was 3, which matched Harwick's count. And then she heard Decker's voice from the corridor, raised slightly, calling out in the careful, deliberate cadence of a negotiator opening contact. This is Agent Decker, Federal Task Force. I'd like to talk. Nobody's making any moves. A response from inside the main room, sharp, cutting him off. She used the sound to cover her movement from the supply room to the interior doorway. The cardiac unit's main room was not large. It had 4 patient bays separated by curtain dividers. 3 were currently occupied, which she hadn't known until this moment. 3 patients instead of 2. Either Harwick's count had been off, or a third patient had been moved here during the initial chaos. 2 nurses, one of them very young, maybe a first year, were pressed against the far wall next to the window. The 2 operatives were positioned on either side of the main corridor entrance, weapons trained on the door where Decker's voice was coming from. Neither of them was watching the interior doorway she was standing in, because the interior doorway connected to the supply room, and as far as they knew, the supply room was covered. She had maybe 4 seconds before one of them moved. She used 3. The first operative, sir, the one on the left, closer to her. She reached before he had turned. The second heard the movement and started to pivot, and she was already pulling the first operative between herself and the second's line of aim, and she said, loudly, clearly, with no waver, "Drop it." In the corridor, she could hear Decker reacting to the shift in sound, his footsteps quickening, his voice dropping the negotiation cadence. The second operative held. His weapon was up. He was making a calculation. The distance between her and his partner, the angle, whether he could do what he was considering. "The man you have in that supply room," she said, "is already down. The 3 you left in the corridor upstairs are in federal custody. Your exit is closed." She kept her voice level. "You're the last decision in this building. Make a good one." A long, specific silence. Then the second operative lowered his weapon to shoulder level, not dropping it, but lowering it, and Decker came through the door with 2 soldiers behind him, fast and practiced, and it was over in the time it took to exhale. Not clean. The younger nurse had a cut on her hand from broken glass she'd been crouching near, and one of the patients, an older man with a cardiac monitor still attached, had pulled his IV line halfway out during the commotion and was bleeding from his wrist. Abigail crossed to him first, clamping the site with her hand and calling for a replacement line. The Bolsheviki line, and the young nurse who had been trembling against the wall looked at her for a moment. At the scrubs, the badge, the sidearm she'd set on the nearest surface, and then moved to get the supply kit because nursing training does what it does even when your hands are still shaking. Abigail got the IV site controlled. She checked the man's monitor. She looked at the young nurse. "What's your name?" "Perry," the nurse said. Her voice was thin but steady. "Kelsey Perry." "You did okay, Kelsey. You stayed still and you kept them calm, and that mattered." She looked at the line she was holding. "Get me a 20 gauge and some tape." Kelsey got her the 20 gauge and the tape. Decker appeared at her shoulder. "The 4th operative," he said quietly. "I know. Harwick wants you back at command. In 2 minutes." She taped the IV site, checked it, looked at the patient's face. He was in his 70s, pale and frightened, and he was gripping the bed rail with both hands. She put one hand briefly on top of his. "You're secure. The building is secure. We're going to get you back to your physician as soon as the floor is cleared." He nodded. He didn't let go of the rail. She retrieved her sidearm and went back through the corridor with Decker, and as they moved through the east wing, she could hear the building slowly changing. The military team moving floor by floor, clearing and confirming, the radio traffic shifting from active engagement language to holding and securing. The immediate crisis was contained. The 3 hostage takers were in custody. The cardiac unit patients were unharmed. But the 4th operative was still somewhere in the building. And Abigail knew, with the kind of knowledge that sits in the chest rather than the head, that the 4th wasn't an operative in the same way the others were. The others had been tactical, trained, professional, executing a plan. The 4th was something different. The 4th had been in the building for a reason that had nothing to do with holding corridors or controlling exits. She had been thinking about this since the command vehicle, about the cell and the network and the analyst's half-finished sentence about an extraction target, about who builds a network capable of coordinating a multi-point assault on a civilian hospital in rural Arizona, and why, and what they'd actually need badly enough to do it. They wouldn't do it for information. You don't need to burn a hospital to extract information from a former special operations medic. You burn a hospital if you need the person themselves, if what they carry is physical or biological, or if what they know is something that can only be confirmed by the person who was there, in a specific place, at a specific time, and no document trail exists. She had been in a specific place, at a specific time, for a classified operation that had left 3 people dead and 1 network in pieces and 0 paper trail, because the operation had never officially existed. She had spent the last 4 years being very quiet and very invisible in a small hospital in a small city in Arizona, because the people whose network she had helped dismantle had spent 4 years looking for the person responsible. They had found her. The fourth operative wasn't trying to kill her. The fourth operative was trying to get close enough to confirm that she was who they thought she was, so that the people at the top of the chain could make a decision about what to do next. She stopped walking. Decker took 2 more steps and turned back. Marsh? The fourth isn't armed, she said. Or not primarily. They're carrying something for documentation, a way to confirm identity, biometric, photographic, something that transmits to external. She looked at the ceiling. Have your signals team check for any active transmissions from inside the building in the last 20 minutes, specifically anything in the short burst encrypted range. Decker was already on his radio. She started moving again, this time toward the hospital's central atrium, a 2-story open space between the main building and the east wing, with a glass ceiling and a mezzanine level that ran along 3 sides. It was the one place in the building she hadn't been. It was also the one place in the building with clear sightlines in every direction, ideal for someone who needed to watch without being watched, who needed angles on multiple corridors at once. She went up the interior stairs to the mezzanine level, staying close to the wall below the railing line. The atrium was quiet. Morning light came through the glass ceiling in pale strips, cutting across the floor 2 levels below where a row of seating and a small cafe had been abandoned mid-service, cups on tables, a pastry half-eaten, a bag someone had left on a chair when the first explosion hit. It looked like a photograph of a moment that had stopped. She moved along the mezzanine, checking angles. She found him near the north end, at the corner where the mezzanine turned and the sight line opened toward the main corridor, the route she had taken twice in the last hour. He was sitting with his back against the wall below the railing, which meant he'd been below visibility from both the ground floor and the mezzanine approach. He was compact, middle-aged, wearing civilian clothing, a hospital visitor's lanyard that she was certain he had taken from somewhere rather than been issued. He had a device in his hand that was not a phone. He heard her 2 steps before she reached him, and he moved fast, not toward her but toward the railing, which she understood a half-second later was because he was trying to get a clear transmit angle for whatever the device was doing. She reached him before he cleared the railing. The device clattered to the mezzanine floor. She got it under her boot. He straightened slowly. He was breathing hard. He looked at her face, directly, with the specific focus of someone running a comparison, and something in his expression shifted. 11 years, he said. In English, faintly accented, controlled. We've been looking for 11 years. I know, she said. Then you know this doesn't end here. She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong, had known since the security gap on a Tuesday morning 3 months ago, that whatever had been dormant for 4 years had started moving again, and that a hospital in Dustin Creek was not the end of anything. It was a middle point in something much larger. It ends here for you, she said. She cuffed him with the restraint she still had from the 3rd floor, 2 hours ago, that felt like a different day entirely. She picked up the device with her offhand, keeping it sealed with her palm, and she was reaching for her phone to call Decker when she heard it. A sound from the ground floor of the atrium below, from the direction of the cafe seating. She looked over the railing. One of the nurses from the ground floor, a woman she recognized from the ER, a day shift nurse named Rosalind who had always been quietly cordial to her, who had been in the building when the explosions hit, was standing near the cafe seating with a phone to her ear. Not the hospital's communication system, a personal phone. And she was speaking in a low, fast voice, and she had her back turned in the specific way people turn when they don't want to be overheard. And she was looking directly at the main corridor entrance, the one Abigail had just come through. Abigail stood very still on the mezzanine. Below her, Rosalind finished the call, lowered the phone, and looked up. Their eyes met. For 2 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Rosalind turned and walked fast toward the East Wing corridor, toward the exit, toward the part of the building where the military perimeter was still being established, where a person who knew the building's layout well enough could find gaps in a containment that had been in place for less than an hour. Abigail looked at the man she had cuffed, at the device in her hand, at the direction Rosalind had gone. She made the call to Decker in under 10 seconds. Position, description, direction of movement, the detail about the phone call that changed everything about what they thought they understood about how the attack had been coordinated from the inside. Because the security rotation gap, the 3 Tuesdays, the access to the hospital's layout that the operatives had demonstrated from the first minute. Someone on the inside had given it to them, and that someone had just looked Abigail in the eyes from 30 feet below and started running. Decker's team caught Rosalind Vance 40 meters from the East Wing exit. She didn't run when they reached her. She stopped walking, turned around slowly, and held her hands at waist level in the way someone does when they've already made peace with being caught. Not surrender exactly, but the particular stillness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is almost relieved to put it down. That detail registered with Abigail more than anything else, because panic and calculation she knew how to read, but exhaustion that looks like calm was something different. Abigail came down from the mezzanine with the device sealed in her palm and found Decker with 2 agents flanking Rosalind near the East Wing corridor junction. The military team had established hard positions at both corridor ends now, and the building had the muffled, pressurized quiet of a place being systematically locked down room by room. The last 2 unaccounted operatives had been located on the basement level 12 minutes ago. The building was contained. Rosalind looked at Abigail across the corridor. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of face that didn't give much away under normal circumstances. She had worked day shift at Harlow Valley for 6 years, longer than almost anyone in the ER. She knew the building's rhythms, its security schedules, its maintenance rotations. She knew which corridors were monitored and which ones weren't. She knew exactly which Tuesdays the external security contractor rotated early and left a gap. "How long?" Abigail asked. Rosalind said nothing. "Not asking for a confession. I'll know the timeline from the device anyway." Abigail held it up briefly. "I'm asking because the way the answer lands tells me something about why." A pause. Then, 2 years. 2 years of access reporting. Yes. Decker looked at Abigail sideways. She gave him a slight nod. "Take her, get her to Harwick, let the federal process do what it does." And he moved, and Rosalind went with the agents without making it difficult, which somehow made it worse. Not because compliance was suspicious, but because it confirmed that whatever Rosalind had told herself for 2 years to make this bearable had finally stopped working, and the human cost of that was written clearly on her face, even if nothing else was. Abigail watched them go and stood for a moment in the empty corridor. The building was secure. The hostages were safe. The operatives were in custody. By every tactical metric, the situation had resolved, but the man on the mezzanine had said 11 years, and he wasn't wrong, and the device in her hand, which Harwick's signals team would crack open within the hour, was going to contain a transmission log that pointed somewhere outside this building, to whoever was at the top of the chain that had spent 4 years watching and 2 years building access and 1 morning burning a hospital to find her. The device was evidence. The man on the mezzanine was a thread. Neither of them was the answer. She went to find Harwick. The command vehicle had expanded while she was inside the building. A second vehicle had joined it in the parking structure, and a field intelligence unit had set up a workstation between them with 4 monitors running simultaneous feeds: internal security camera recovery, exterior perimeter positions, the Federal Communications Channel, and a map display showing the regional area with several marked points that she didn't yet have context for. Harwick was on the phone when she came in. He finished the call in under a minute and turned to face her with the expression of someone who has just received information that has changed the shape of his afternoon. "The device?" he said. She put it on the table in front of the signals officer, who picked it up with gloved hands and immediately began working on it. "Active transmission was interrupted before it completed," she said. "Whatever it was trying to send, it didn't finish. But the transmission log will show where it was going and how far it got." "We have a direction already," Harwick said. He turned to the map display. 3 of those markers are cell relay positions we've been tracking for 72 hours. They form a line that terminates at a compound approximately 41 miles northeast of Dustin Creek in the Sorin Basin. Private land, registered to a holding company that our financial team has been untangling for 6 weeks. He put his finger on the terminal marker. That's where the network's leadership element is operating from. Abigail looked at the map. The Sorin Basin was rough country, high desert, isolated, The kind of terrain where a compound could operate with minimal external visibility. Good sight distances in every direction, hard to approach without being seen. The kind of place someone chose specifically because it was defensible and because the time between detecting an approach and completing an extraction was long enough to matter. "They'll know the building operation failed," she said. "They got partial transmission before I interrupted it. They know the hospital is contained. They're already in extraction mode." "That's our assessment as well." "Which means the window on the compound is closing." "Yes." Harwick looked at her directly. "I want you on the operational team for the compound approach." She had expected this. She had been running the shape of it since the mezzanine. "What's the team structure?" "Two elements. Strike team through the primary access road. That's a federal tactical unit, 12 personnel. I want you with a 4-person reconnaissance element that goes in ahead through the eastern approach. The eastern approach is a dry creek bed that runs along the compound's blind side. Their camera coverage has a gap on that approach due to terrain obstruction. The recon element's job is to confirm personnel count, identify the extraction route, and locate any secondary threats before the strike team moves." "Hostages?" "Intelligence suggests the network has been holding 2 individuals at the compound for approximately 3 weeks. We believe they're leverage, not targets, but we don't have confirmation." She absorbed that. Unconfirmed hostages changed the calculus on every strike decision, because the moment a network in extraction mode decides its leverage is no longer useful, the timeline on those 2 people compresses to nothing. "I need the terrain imagery and whatever you have on the compound's internal layout," she said, "and I need 20 minutes. "You have 15, Harwick said. "We move at the window." The eastern approach through the dry creek bed was 4.5 kilometers on foot, over terrain that had the particular quality of looking flat from above and being nothing of the sort at ground level. Abigail went in with 3 members of Harwick's recon element, a former ranger named Briggs, who moved like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, a signals specialist named Okafor, who was young and fast and had the useful quality of not speaking unless he had something worth saying, and a tactical medic named Suarez, who was the closest thing to a peer Abigail had encountered in the last 4 years, not because of her background, but because of the way she looked at a situation, systematically, without drama. They moved in file, maintaining 30-meter spacing, which was more than standard but appropriate for terrain where a single wrong step kicked loot carried. The creek bed was dry and pale, the vegetation along its edges sparse and low. The sun was fully up now, past 9 in the morning, and the desert had begun its daily conversation with heat. Abigail ran her mind through the compound layout from the satellite imagery. A central structure, concrete block, single story, approximately 6,000 square feet. 2 outbuildings, one of which showed heat signatures consistent with a generator. A vehicle bay on the north side with what appeared to be 3 or 4 vehicles. The camera gap on the eastern approach was confirmed by 3 separate passes of imagery, but gaps confirmed from the air don't always translate cleanly to gaps at ground level, and she was operating on the assumption that there were things in the imagery she couldn't see. Briggs pulled up at the head of the file and held up a fist. They stopped. He signaled camera, pointing to a rock formation on the left edge of the creek bed at a position that should have been inside the confirmed gap. She moved up beside him and looked. It was a secondary camera, small, mounted below the sight line of the primary coverage array, angled at 30 degrees to cover exactly the approach corridor the imagery gap had identified. Somebody had put it there specifically to cover what they knew the main system missed. They knew the gap existed, they had covered it, which meant either the imagery intelligence was compromised or the compound security team was competent enough to anticipate that the gap would be identified and act accordingly. She signaled to Okafor. He came forward with the signals unit. 45 seconds of work, reading the camera's transmission frequency, told them it was operating on the same encrypted short-range system as the devices inside the hospital. "Can you loop it?" she asked quietly. "Need 6 minutes and I need it to have a rest cycle I can grab onto." He checked his readings. "It cycles every 4 minutes. If I catch the next cycle start, I can insert a loop on the second rotation." "Do it." They held position in the creek bed for 8 minutes, 4 minutes to catch the cycle, 6 to execute the loop, with 2 minutes of confirmed hold to verify it was running. 8 minutes of stillness in open terrain, with the heat already building and the silence of the desert doing what desert silence does, which is make every sound feel louder than it is. When Okafor gave the all clear, They moved. The creek bed opened onto a shallow depression 40 meters south of the compound's eastern wall. From the depression, she had her first clear ground-level view of the structure. It matched the imagery, but the imagery had not conveyed the quality of the fencing, heavy gauge, not the standard agricultural wire, or the fact that there was a rooftop position on the central structure's northeast corner that the satellite angle had shown as an equipment array, but which, at ground level, was clearly a covered observation post. She counted one person at the post. Stationary, facing northwest, the direction of the primary access road. She relayed this to Harwick via the secure channel in a low-voice transmission. He acknowledged and updated the strike team. Then she counted vehicles in the bay. The imagery had shown 3 or 4. There were 2 now, which meant 1 or 2 had left, either before the hospital operation or in the window since. If extraction was already underway, if the leadership element had moved the moment the hospital transmission cut off, the compound might be running on skeleton crew. Or they might want it to look that way. "I want the south outbuilding," she told Briggs. "The one without the generator. It's the most isolated structure on the site, and it's the lowest visibility position for anyone watching from the main building. If they're holding someone, that's where." "Strike team is 12 minutes out," Briggs said. "I know. I'm not asking to move yet." She watched the compound for 3 more minutes. She counted movement patterns. 2 individuals visible through the main structure's windows on the east face, moving periodically, not static. The rooftop observer stayed northwest facing and did not alter position. The south outbuilding showed no movement and no light. No movement could mean empty. No movement could also mean 2 people who had been told to be very still. She made a decision. "Suarez," she said, "you're with me on the south outbuilding. Briggs, Okafor, stay in position and maintain feed to the strike team. If anyone exits the main structure toward our direction before we're back, you call it immediately and we divert." Briggs looked at her. "Protocol says hold for the strike team. Protocol says recon element confirms personnel and secondary threats. That outbuilding is a secondary threat until I know what's in it." She met his eyes. "If those 2 people in there are moved in the next 12 minutes because the extraction team decided to use them as mobile leverage, the strike team hits an empty compound and we lose both them and whatever intelligence the leadership was carrying." A beat. 12 minutes, Briggs said. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was acknowledgement. She and Suarez moved. The south outbuilding was padlocked from the outside, which was the first useful confirmation. You don't padlock from the outside to contain equipment, you do it to contain people. Suarez had bolt cutters that she used with the quiet efficiency of someone who had practiced this enough that it didn't take thought. The lock came free. Abigail eased the door open with her shoulder. The smell hit first. Confined space, poor ventilation, the particular staleness of air in a room where people have been for days without adequate circulation. Then light, a single battery lantern in the corner, low but enough. Then 2 people, a man and a woman, both sitting against the far wall with their wrists secured to a wall anchor. Mid-30s, both of them, with the particular look of people who are past the panic stage and into the flat, conserving state that sets in after several days of captivity. The man had a healing laceration above his left eye. The woman was dehydrated. She could tell that from the skin texture and the way she moved when she saw them, slowly, like someone managing resources. "Federal team," Abigail said quietly. "Don't speak loudly. We're going to get you out." The woman looked at her with the wariness of someone who had been told things by people in this building before. "Show me something," she said. Her voice was rough. Abigail showed her Harwick's identification card, which she had been given before departure. The woman looked at it, looked at Abigail's face, and something in her expression changed. Not relief, not yet, but the first structural movement toward it. Suarez was already at the wall anchor, working the securing mechanism. The man's wrists came free first, and he immediately tried to stand and couldn't. His legs had been in the same position too long, and the circulation was wrong. Suarez caught him before he went down, which she did without comment, steadying him with the calm practicality of someone for whom this was a medical problem first. "Can you walk?" Abigail asked the woman. "I can walk." She came to her feet more slowly than she wanted to, using the wall. "There are documents," she said. They had documents. A drive in the main building, room on the north side. It had a lock on it that wasn't like the others. I saw them take it there. What kind of documents? Personnel files, people's names, real names, cover identities, locations. The woman looked at her steadily. A list of people like you. The air in the outbuilding felt different after that sentence. A list of people like her meant a list of former operations personnel living under quiet identities in ordinary lives. It meant that whoever had been running this network for 11 years had not been building toward a single extraction. They had been building a comprehensive targeting package. Find one person, use them to confirm the methodology, then work through the list. Abigail had not been the target. She had been the proof of concept. She told Suarez to start moving both individuals toward the creek bed, and she went back to the secure channel. Harwick. South outbuilding confirmed. 2 individuals, ambulatory with assistance, medical attention required, non-critical. There is also an intelligence target in the main structure. North room, secured drive. Personnel list. Do not let the strike team breach before that room is specifically isolated and secured. Harwick's response was immediate. Copy. Strike team ETA 9 minutes. What's your position? Outbuilding, moving to extract. Get your people to the creek bed. Strike team takes the main structure. She was turning to follow Suarez when she heard the vehicle. Not from the access road, from the west, a direction that didn't correspond to any marked route on the satellite imagery, which meant a track that wasn't on any map, which meant someone at this compound had a planned exit route that the intelligence package had missed entirely. She went back to the outbuilding door and looked. One of the vehicles from the bay was moving. The second one she had counted, the one that had been there when she arrived. It was moving west, fast, already past the compound's perimeter fence and onto whatever track ran through the western terrain. The rooftop observer position was empty now. The main structure's east-facing windows were dark. The compound was emptying, not chaotically, methodically. Someone had made the call at a specific moment, and they were executing a withdrawal sequence that had been planned in advance. She called Briggs. Vehicle moving west, single vehicle, direction is off the mapped routes. I need Harwick to know there's an unmapped western exit, and whoever is in that vehicle has a window. Already on it, Briggs said. But Marsh, what? The signals team just finished breaking down the device from the mezzanine, the partial transmission that got through before you shut it down. She waited. It wasn't an identity confirmation. It was a location ping. It transmitted your position inside the hospital. A pause. And it went to 2 endpoints, not one. One of them is consistent with the compound. The other one? Briggs stopped. Say it. The other endpoint is a relay station we've been tracking for 8 months. It's associated with a different network. Not the one we've been mapping, something we don't have a full picture of yet. The desert was very quiet. The vehicle to the west was already small in the distance, trailing a line of pale dust. They shared her position with someone else, Suarez said quietly. She had come back to the outbuilding door, had left the 2 freed individuals at a safe hold position and come back. And she was looking at Abigail with the specific attention of someone who understands that the landscape of a situation has just changed. The someone else was not the network in this compound. The someone else was a second network, one that Harwick's operation had been adjacent to for 8 months without fully mapping, and they now had a confirmed location for a person they had apparently been looking for independently. The compound hadn't been the end of anything. It was a handoff point. And the vehicle moving west across the desert was carrying whoever had just completed the handoff. Abigail looked at the distance between the vehicle and the ridgeline it was moving toward. 3 kilometers, maybe less, rough terrain, a window that was closing in minutes. She looked at the secure channel in her hand, at the 9 minutes she'd been told the strike team needed, at the ridgeline that would swallow the vehicle before any aerial asset could be repositioned. She looked at Suarez. Can you hold the 2 of them in the creek bed position until the strike team arrives? Suarez looked at the vehicle, looked back at Abigail. You're not going to wait for the strike team. The strike team has the compound. The compound isn't the problem anymore. You're one person and that vehicle has at minimum the driver and whoever gave the order to move. I know. Harwick is going to tell Harwick where I'm going and why. She was already moving. The drive in the north room is the priority. Make sure the strike team knows that before they breach. Suarez said something under her breath in Spanish that Abigail didn't catch. And then she went back to the creek bed, and Abigail went west, across open desert, toward the ridgeline and the vehicle, and whatever was on the other side of both. The terrain was worse than it looked. The ground between the compound and the ridgeline was irregular, shallow arroyos and loose shale patches that required constant adjustment, places where the footing was reliable, and places where it absolutely wasn't. She had crossed 200 meters when she turned her left ankle on a shale patch that shifted under her weight. And she didn't stop moving, but the ankle registered its complaint clearly enough that she knew she'd be feeling it for days. She kept moving. The vehicle had reached the base of the ridgeline and slowed. The track it was on had to navigate a series of switchbacks up the slope, and switchbacks meant it was slower than open desert. She was closing the distance. Not fast enough on foot to intercept before the ridge, but the switchbacks bought her time. She was on the radio to Harwick as she ran, giving position and direction, requesting aerial support on the far side of the ridge, hearing him respond in the clipped, controlled register of someone simultaneously managing multiple complex situations and not enjoying any of them. "Aerial asset is 14 minutes, he said. "Can you hold position on the ridge?" "I'll be at the ridge in 4 minutes. I don't know what's on the other side." "Neither do I yet." "Marsh, do not go over that ridge alone." She didn't answer, which she knew he would interpret correctly. The ridgeline was harder than the approach. Loose rock and steep grade, the kind of surface that made a turned ankle relevant in a way flat ground hadn't. She went up on her hands and knees for the last 20 meters, keeping below the crest, and when she came over the top, she stayed flat and looked. The far side of the ridge opened onto a wider valley, broader and flatter than the Soren Basin, with a dirt airstrip that she had not seen in any imagery, oriented northeast to southwest, with a small fuel cache at the southern end and a single structure at the northern end that might have been a maintenance shed. The vehicle from the compound was at the northern end of the strip. 2 people had gotten out. She could see them from the ridge crest, 400 meters away, moving toward the structure. And at the southern end of the strip, coming in low from the southwest, was a small aircraft. Twin engine, the kind designed for rough strips and fast loading and not much else. 10 minutes. Maybe less before it was on the ground and loaded and gone. She had no vehicle, no aerial support for 14 minutes, an ankle that was making itself increasingly known, and 400 meters of open ground between her and the strip. And then her phone, the personal phone, not the secure channel, buzzed once. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A message that was 2 lines. The first line was coordinates, not for her position, for a point on the airstrip near the fuel cache at the south end. The second line was 4 words, "Don't let him board." She stared at the message for 1 full second. Then she looked at the southern end of the strip, at the fuel cache, at the aircraft coming in on final approach. Someone else knew about this airstrip, someone who was not Harwick, and not anyone on the federal team, because the federal team didn't have her personal number, and whoever had sent this had it, and had used it, and had sent coordinates instead of words, because coordinates were faster, and she was 400 meters away, and the aircraft was 2 minutes from touchdown. Someone else was watching the strip, and they needed her at the south end, not the north. She went over the ridge and started down. The south end of the airstrip was 400 meters of open desert, and she ran it badly. The turned ankle made the downhill off the ridge worse than the climb had been, and by the time she reached flat ground, she was compensating with every stride in a way that was going to cost her tomorrow, assuming tomorrow was something she got. The aircraft was on final approach. Twin engine, low and loud, gear already down. It was going to touch the southern end of the strip first, standard for a short field with obstacles at the north, which meant it would roll toward the fuel cache and the structure where the 2 people from the compound vehicle were waiting. She had maybe 90 seconds before it was on the ground and decelerating, and the loading sequence began. She reached the fuel cache at a dead run and stopped behind it, pressing her back to the metal housing, chest working hard. The cache was a standard aviation fuel tank on a wheeled platform, the kind used at remote strips, approximately 800 liters, she estimated, with a gravity feed pump nozzle coiled on one side. The plane touched down 40 meters to her south. It was louder than she expected at this distance, the engines not yet throttling back, and the prop wash hit her like a wall of hot air when it rolled past. It slowed. The engines wound down to taxi speed. It turned toward the north end of the strip, which put it moving away from her position with its tail toward her. She looked at the fuel cache. She looked at the nozzle. She looked at the plane's tail and the small access panel above the left main gear that indicated the fuel port location. Then she looked at her phone. No second message. Just the coordinates, which had put her here, and the instruction, don't let him board. Him. Not them, one specific person. She looked north. The two people from the vehicle were walking toward the plane now. One was shorter, moving quickly, a bag over one shoulder. Logistics, support. The other was taller, older, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who was accustomed to other people adjusting their speed to match his. She couldn't see faces at this distance, but the body language was clear. The taller one was the principal. The shorter one was getting him out. She needed to stop the plane. She had a sidearm, one spare magazine, an ankle that was unreliable on uneven ground, and no aerial support for 11 minutes. She had a fuel cache. She pulled the nozzle free of its coil and opened the valve all the way. Aviation fuel? The smell hit immediately, sharp and chemical, began flowing fast from the nozzle onto the ground between the cache and the taxi path the plane had just used. She dragged the nozzle in a line across the strip, 20 meters, creating a fuel spill across the only usable taxi path between the south touchdown zone and the north end where the passengers were waiting. Then she got back behind the cache and called Harwick. Strip is active, aircraft on ground, twin engine, rolling north to load. I have a fuel obstacle across the taxi path. Aircraft cannot complete northern load and depart without coming back through it. I need aerial support on this position in the next 10 minutes, or this aircraft is gone. Harwick's voice was tight. Aerial is repositioning. 12 minutes, Marsh. What's your status? Operational, fuel spill across taxi path. The aircraft's going to figure out the problem when it tries to turn back south. She looked at the taxi path. That gives me maybe 3 minutes of confusion before they understand what's happened and start looking for the source. Do not engage the principal directly. Define directly. Marsh. I'll call you back. She put the phone in her pocket and moved to the eastern edge of the strip, using the low scrub vegetation as cover. It wasn't much, but it broke her silhouette against the terrain, and at this distance and light angle she was harder to locate than she would have been in the open. The plane reached the north end of the strip, and the engines changed note as the pilot began setting up for the turnaround. The two men who had walked from the vehicle reached the aircraft's left side door just as the plane completed its turn. The door opened. One of them was already boarding. Then the pilot must have seen the fuel spill because the engines went to idle and stayed there. A pause. The man at the door stepped back. She could see the pilot's window. The pilot looking south along the taxi path, looking at the dark, wet line across the pale dirt of the strip, looking for the cause. The taller man, the principal, turned and looked south. His movement had changed. I was scanning now, not waiting. She had 60 seconds before they made a decision. They could attempt to take off from the north end directly. The strip was long enough if the pilot was aggressive. Or they could abort and go back to the vehicle. Either way, once they committed, her window closed. She moved out of the scrub and walked onto the strip. Not running. Walking. Directly toward them, in the open, at a pace that was controlled enough to communicate that she wasn't panicking, which she wasn't. The shorter man saw her first. He said something to the principal and reached for something at his hip. She had her sidearm out and said loudly enough to carry across the strip noise, "Federal operation, don't." The shorter man stopped. The principal looked at her. He was in his 60s, with a face that was lined and specific and somehow familiar in the way faces sometimes are when you've seen photographs of them in classified documents in a different life. Gray at the temples, a beard that was trimmed but not recently, eyes that were doing the same systematic calculation she had seen in the operatives at the hospital, but more experienced, more patient, the look of someone who has played out more variations of a situation than the other people in the room. "You're Marsh," he said. He had an accent that placed him somewhere in the former Eastern Bloc without pinpointing it. Not the man from the mezzanine, someone older, someone who had been running this a long time before the mezzanine man was recruited. "Yes," she said. "You're alone." "For about 10 more minutes." He looked at the fuel spill. He looked at her. He made a calculation that she could see him making: distance, angle, her weapon, the shorter man's position, the pilot who was still behind the windscreen and probably had his own calculation running. "The drive," she said. "From the north room, the personnel list. Your team pulled it before they left the compound." A pause. "Even if that were true," he said, "you're standing on a desert airstrip with a handgun. And you're standing on a fuel spill with 11 minutes of clear air left." She held his gaze. The shorter man has the drive on him. I can see the bag is wrong, too structured for the way he's carrying it. It's a hard case. Neither man moved. I'm not asking for it back, she said. I'm telling you that federal forensics already pulled the transmission logs from the device your man used in the hospital. They have the second endpoint. They know about the second network. A beat. You ran this operation to complete a handoff. The handoff is already compromised. Something shifted in the principal's expression. Not much, but enough. Then what do you want? He said. I want you to sit down on the ground and wait 10 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the ridge she had come over, at the sky beyond it where there was nothing yet but would not be nothing for much longer. He sat down. The shorter man did not. He moved, not toward her but sideways toward the plane's nose, putting the landing gear between himself and her sightline, and she was already adjusting when the pilot's door opened on the far side of the aircraft, and the pilot came out fast and came around the nose, and that was two problems in a space where she had one weapon. She took the shorter man out of the equation, the same way she had taken the men out of the corridor upstairs, precise, non-lethal, the shoulder joint, and he went down hard onto the fuel-soaked dirt, and the bag skidded away from him. The pilot stopped at the aircraft's nose. He was holding his hands at shoulder height, and she realized a half-second later that his hands were empty. He wasn't security. He was a pilot who had just watched two things happen in rapid succession and had made a very rapid and correct personal assessment. Stay there, she said. Staying, the pilot said, with the flat effect of a man who had decided this was not his problem. She moved to the bag. She kept her angle on the principal, who was still sitting in the dirt with his hands visible, watching her with the patient attention of someone who is storing information for later use. She got the bag and pulled it toward her without picking it up. No clean surfaces to set it on, fuel on the ground. She kept it moving, and worked the zipper one-handed. Hard case inside. Military-grade encrypted drive. She recognized the model. She put it in her jacket pocket and looked at the principal. 11 years, she said. That's a long time to look for one person. You dismantled something that took a long time to build, he said. Yes, and it needed to be dismantled. He looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, and was probably the mixture of both. That happens when someone recognizes that a situation has been lost to an opponent they respect despite themselves. She kept her weapon on him and called Harwick, and this time she gave him the full position, the aircraft tail number, the pilot's status, the principal sitting in the dirt, and the drive in her pocket. And she said, I need your aerial asset on this position as soon as it's available, and I need a federal medical team for a gunshot wound, non-critical, shoulder, the man near the left main gear. She stood on the airstrip in the desert heat for 9 minutes, alone except for a sitting principal, a grounded pilot, and a man with a shoulder wound she had already assessed and determined was losing blood at a manageable rate, and she used 6 of those 9 minutes to apply field dressings from the small kit she had been carrying since she left the hospital, because the wound was not going to kill him, but it needed pressure, and the alternative was letting him deteriorate for 9 minutes in the dirt, and that was not something she was going to do. He was conscious and looked at her while she worked. You're the nurse, he said, with the confused tone of someone reconciling two separate categories. I'm the nurse, she said, and kept working. What's? The aerial asset arrived at minute 9. Federal vehicles came up the unmapped western track at minute 14. Briggs had found it from the ridge during the strike team's compound clearance, which told her he was better than his protocol-first exterior suggested. Harwick was in the third vehicle, and when he stepped out onto the airstrip and looked at the scene, the aircraft, the fuel spill, the sitting principal, the man being treated by Abigail on the ground, he had the expression of someone who has learned to stop being surprised by specific people and has not entirely succeeded. The compound? She asked, before he said anything. Secured. Drive from the north room is in federal custody. Personnel list is partially intact. There's encrypted layering, but our technical team is confident on recovery. He looked at the principal. And him? Wants a lawyer, which means he knows exactly what the federal exposure is and isn't going to make it worse by talking without one. She stood up from the man on the ground and pulled off her gloves. The drive in my pocket has the transmission logs from the mezzanine device, the second endpoint connection. That's more useful than anything he'll say voluntarily. Harwick took the drive from her. He looked at it, then at her. You went over that ridge without authorization, he said. I went over the ridge with the information I had. I told you to hold position. The window was 4 minutes. Aerial was 12. She met his eyes. If I hold position, he's in the air before you have coverage on the far side. A pause. I know, Harwick said. It wasn't approval exactly, but it wasn't a reprimand either. It was the acknowledgement of someone who understood that the gap between what protocol required and what the situation allowed had been real, and that she had made a judgment call in that gap that had produced results. He handed the drive to an agent beside him and turned toward the principal. She walked back to the aircraft and leaned against the fuselage in the shade of the wing and let herself notice the ankle for the first time since the ridge. It was worse than she'd allowed herself to register while moving. She could put weight on it, which meant it was a sprain rather than a fracture, but it was swelling inside her shoe, and the next 48 hours were going to be uncomfortable. Suarez appeared from the direction of the western track, which meant she had come up with Harwick's vehicles. She looked at Abigail against the aircraft, at the ankle, at the blood on her sleeve that was still not hers. The two from the outbuilding? Abigail asked. Federal medical team has them. The woman's dehydrated but stable. The man needed the laceration above his eye looked at. It had started to close badly, needed to be cleaned and resutured. Suarez crouched beside the ankle without asking, running her hands along the lateral side with the methodical precision of someone doing an assessment rather than offering comfort. Probably grade 2. You're not going to be running on it tomorrow. I know. You ran on it today. I know that too. Suarez sat back on her heels. You know what I'm going to say. That I should have waited for the strike team. That you should have told someone about the phone message instead of going over a ridge alone. Suarez looked at her directly. Who sent it? Abigail had been thinking about that since the moment she'd read it. The personal number. The coordinates. The 4 words that were specific enough to be operational intelligence and timed precisely enough to indicate someone had eyes on the strip before she did. I don't know, she said, which was true. She had a suspicion, but a suspicion built on a 4-year-old memory of a network she had helped dismantle, and the possibility that not everyone in that network had been on the same side of things. It was too thin to say out loud until she had something more. You don't know, Suarez repeated. Not yet. Suarez looked at her for a moment and then said, in the tone of someone choosing to leave something for later, The compound's clear. We have the drive, we have the principal, we have 6 operatives in federal custody, and the 2 from the hospital who you put down non-lethally are going to have a long time to think about their life choices. A pause. It's over. Part of it is, Abigail said. Well, they flew her back to Dustin Creek in one of the military rotorcraft, and the hospital was a different place from the one she had left 8 hours earlier. The exterior perimeter had been pulled back from the hard military positioning to a federal security boundary, tape, vehicles, personnel in clearly marked jackets, and the press had arrived in numbers, 2 satellite trucks, and a cluster of journalists behind the perimeter tape on the hospital's north side. Inside the main entrance, the lobby had been cleared of the tactical equipment, and the glass had been swept, and a federal evidence team was working through the building systematically, documenting and collecting. She went to the ICU first. The 3 ventilator patients were on full automated support, the power restored, the battery backups recharged and logged. Tamsin Doyle was at the nursing station doing charting, and when she looked up and saw Abigail come through the ICU door, she put down her pen in the specific way people put things down when they are deciding how to handle something they've been holding for hours. All 3 stable, Tamsin said. I saw the board. The one in Bay 2 had a pressure event around noon. His systolic dropped. I caught it on the 6-minute check. We adjusted the vent settings, and he came back up. She paused. The protocol you left worked. Abigail looked at the board. She looked at the patients in their bays, each breathing with the even mechanical rhythm of properly set ventilators. She thought about the protocol revision that Vel had dismissed at the safety meeting, and the way she had distributed it anyway under the heading of a training refresh, and the 2 weeks Tamsin had spent being mildly annoyed at her for doing it wrong. Thank you, Abigail said, for running it. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. The patient in Bay 2 would have coded without it, she said. Probably. There's no probably about it. You set those manual backup intervals specifically for his profile. I noticed when I went back through it. Tamsin looked at her directly. You set that protocol for 3 specific patients based on their individual vent dependencies, not as a general drill. Abigail didn't answer that. You knew something was coming, Tamsin said. I knew there was a risk. I didn't know when or exactly how. And you didn't tell anyone because I didn't have enough to make a credible report that wouldn't be dismissed as a nurse's weekend reading project. She said it without sharpness, because it wasn't an accusation. It was just the true shape of the situation as it had been. Tamsin absorbed that. Her expression moved through something complicated and then settled. 3 patients who are alive, she said. Yes. Okay, Tamsin said, which was not a small word the way she said it, and went back to her charting. Vel found her 40 minutes later. She was in the staff break room, sitting with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, with her boot off and the ankle wrapped in a compression bandage that Suarez had produced from somewhere before the helicopter. Her jacket was folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at nothing in particular, doing the specific thing she had been doing in the hours after every operation she had ever been part of, running back through the sequence, checking for errors, finding the places where things had been close, and understanding why they had or hadn't gone wrong. She heard him in the doorway before he spoke. He stood there for a moment, which was unusual. Marcus Vel was not a man who stood in doorways. He entered rooms with the energy of someone who owned them. The federal agents are asking for you, he said. I know. I told them 15 minutes. He came into the break room. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was more unusual than the doorway hesitation. She watched him. He looked like he had aged several hours in the course of one day. His surgical scrubs were still clean. He'd apparently changed at some point. But his face had the drained, slightly disorganized quality of a man whose model of the world had been revised without his permission. The patient in Bay 2 in the ICU, he said. Herman Price, 71, ischemic cardiomyopathy, admitted 4 days ago. You set up a manual backup protocol specifically for him. For him and 2 others with similar vent dependencies. When I dismissed your protocol proposal. Yes. He was quiet. He put both hands flat on this table in front of him, the way someone does when they need something to push against. How did you know there was going to be a power disruption? He said. I didn't know. I knew the backup generator had a documented response lag, and that the lag wasn't addressed in the existing protocol, and that 3 patients would be in danger if a disruption exceeded a specific duration. I told you the generator had passed its inspections. It had. That doesn't address the lag. Another silence. Herman Price, Vel said again, like the name was something he needed to get right. He has a daughter. She's been here every day at 2 o'clock. Abigail looked at her coffee. She brings him crossword puzzles, the paper kind, because he doesn't like the phone ones. Vel looked at his hands. I was wrong, he said. He said it the way someone says something they have been rehearsing in their head and are now deploying before they lose the nerve for it. About you. About what you were capable of. About... He stopped. About the protocol. She looked at him. He was not a man who found this easy. She could see that, and she had no particular interest in making it easier or harder. He had been wrong in ways that had been costly and humiliating for her, and potentially lethal for a man who did crossword puzzles with his daughter. I know, she said. Not as forgiveness. As confirmation. I have to report what happened today to the board, he said. The security gap. The decision not to escalate your protocol proposal through the safety committee. The fact that there were warnings. He stopped again. I don't know exactly what the outcome is going to look like. No, she said. Neither do I. He stood. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who doesn't know what category to put someone in anymore, and then he left. She sat with her cold coffee for another 10 minutes, and then she put her boot back on, carefully, slowly, with the acknowledgement that the ankle was going to make her pay for that decision, and went to find the federal agents. The debriefing took 3 hours. It was held in the hospital administrator's conference room, which had not been damaged in the explosion, and it involved Agent Decker, 2 analysts she hadn't met before, a senior federal attorney named Margot Fenn, who had apparently flown in from the Phoenix field office sometime during the afternoon, and a recording system that Fenn explained would be used for evidentiary purposes in multiple pending prosecutions. Abigail told them everything in the order it had happened, without editorializing, from the Tuesday security rotation gap she had noticed 3 months ago to the moment the aerial asset arrived on the strip. She answered Fenn's questions with the same flat, factual precision she brought to patient charting, specific, documented, without embellishment or omission. When she finished, Fenn looked at her over the table. "The phone message," Fenn said. "The unknown number with the coordinates." "Yes." "You have no confirmed identification of the sender." "No." "But you acted on the information." "The coordinates were accurate. The instruction was consistent with the operational objective. I assessed the risk of acting on unverified intelligence against the risk of ignoring it with 4 minutes of window and made a judgment." Fenn wrote something down. She had the practiced neutrality of someone who had conducted many debriefings and had learned that the space between questions was often more useful than the questions themselves. "The personnel list on the drive from the North Room," Abigail said. "What's the recovery status?" "Our technical team has approximately 60% of the encrypted layers addressed. We expect full recovery within 72 hours. When you have the full list, those individuals will be contacted through appropriate federal channels," Fenn said, "discreetly and with security protocols." She looked at Abigail. "Including, if your name appears on it, appropriate measures for your situation." Abigail looked at the table. Her name was going to be on it. She already knew that. What she didn't know was what came after. What appropriate measures looked like for a person who had spent 4 years building a quiet life inside a hospital in a small city, and who had just burned through that cover in the space of one morning by picking up a rifle in a hallway because there had been no other choice. The cover was gone. The 11-year network was dismantled, or most of it. The second network, the one connected to the other endpoint, was still a shape without a center. "There's a second network," she said. "The second endpoint from the mezzanine device. You said your team has been tracking it for 8 months without a full picture." "That's correct." "The personnel list is going to have people on it who are connected to the second network as well as the first. They're not the same organization. They've been operating in parallel, and they've had a handoff arrangement for intelligence." She paused. "The person who sent me the coordinates, whoever that was, knew about the airstrip. They had eyes on it before I got there. That suggests they've been watching the network's extraction infrastructure, which means they have information on the second organization's structure that your team doesn't have yet." Fenn stopped writing. She looked up. "You're suggesting the sender of that message is a source," she said. "I'm suggesting the sender of that message knew things that aren't in your current intelligence picture and chose to use me as the intervention point rather than going through official channels." Abigail met her eyes. "That's either someone who can't go through official channels or someone who doesn't trust them." The room was quiet. Decker, from the far end of the table. "Or both." "Or both," Abigail said. Fenn looked at the recording device. She looked at her notes. She said, "We'll need the phone." "I know." She handed it over. Fenn set it on the table beside her notepad and looked at it for a moment before she flagged the evidence officer. Then she looked at Abigail. "One more question," she said. "The hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. Vell. You were told 3 weeks ago that you were being placed on a performance improvement plan. A 60-day performance evaluation notice." "Yes." "And you said nothing about the security concerns you'd been tracking at that point." "I had attempted to raise the protocol concern through the department safety meeting. It was not accepted." She paused. "The security concerns, the rotation gap. I didn't have enough to make a formal report that would have been taken seriously. I had enough to take individual precautions." Fenn wrote something, looked up. "The precautions saved lives." "Yes." "The system that dismissed you failed to stop this attack." "The system that dismissed me was also part of what made the attack possible," Abigail said. "The access gap on Tuesdays existed because the external security contractor wasn't being properly supervised. That's an administrative failure. The protocol gap that put 3 ventilator patients at risk during a power disruption was a documentation failure that I flagged and was overruled on." She looked at Fenn steadily. "I'm not interested in assigning blame. I'm interested in those gaps being closed so the next person who flags them gets heard." Fenn looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something at the bottom of her notepad, underlined it, and moved to the next page. After the debriefing, the attorney asked her to wait in the corridor while she made 2 phone calls. Abigail sat on a chair in the corridor and looked at the wall and thought about the phone message, and the unknown number and the 8 months Harwick's team had been watching a second network without a full picture, and she thought about the particular way the principal had looked at her on the airstrip, not like she was a threat, but like she was a variable he had failed to fully account for. She thought about Rosalind Vance, who had been in this building every day for 6 years and had spent 2 of them feeding access information to people who burned hospitals. She thought about what 2 years of that looked like from the inside. The weight of it, the way it changes the shape of ordinary days. She had not liked what she saw in Rosalind's face in the corridor, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was a little too familiar. That particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something you can no longer put down and no longer fully defend. The attorney came back out of the conference room. She had both phones in one hand and a separate folder in the other. "We have a preliminary outcome from the federal review of the hospital's security contractor arrangement," she said. "The contractor's rotation logs and the internal communications have been pulled. There are email records indicating the security gap on Tuesday rotations was not accidental. It was arranged specifically to facilitate building access, and there is an internal party at the administrative level who appears in those communications." Abigail looked up. "Not Rosalind Vance." "Not her." Fenn looked at the folder. "The hospital's external operations director, a man named Gareth Pollard. He's been with the institution for 9 years. The communications suggest he has been in contact with the network for approximately 3 years, 1 year longer than Vance." She paused. "He was taken into federal custody 40 minutes ago. He was in the building at the time. Apparently he had remained on site to support administrative crisis management." Abigail absorbed that. Gareth Pollard. She knew the name the way she knew everyone's name in the building, from the directory, from passing interactions, from the particular way administrative people move through hospitals, as if the institution is a thing they manage rather than a thing that serves patients. She had not had him on her list. She had not seen him in the rotation gap, had not found his name in the badge access record she had reviewed, which meant he had been more careful than Rosalind, or he had known what to hide and how. "The email records," she said, "do they document the specific information he provided?" "Yes, including the building layout and security rotation schedule." Fenn paused. "Including a personnel file on a specific employee that he forwarded 14 months ago." A pause. "Mine," Abigail said. "A version of yours. Incomplete, because your background documentation has gaps that he couldn't access at the administrative level, but enough to confirm the name and the physical location." Fenn looked at her steadily. He was the one who told them where to look. Vance filled in the operational details over time. Abigail sat with that for a moment. 14 months ago. She had been at Harlow Valley for 11 months, which meant Pollard had started looking before she arrived, had been watching the employee rosters for a specific profile, and had found her within 3 months of her start date. 3 months of her thinking she was invisible, while someone 2 administrative levels above her was already sending her name east. She had almost had this right. She had seen most of the picture. She had not seen Pollard. That bothered her in the specific way that incomplete assessment always did. Not panic, not even distress exactly, but the cold, precise discomfort of knowing that she had operated with a gap in her information and that the gap had been there the whole time and she had not found it. "The board," she said. "The hospital board. Are they aware of Pollard's arrest?" "They've been notified in the last hour." Fenn looked at her notes. "There will be a board emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Given the scope of what's been documented today, I expect the administrative and governance implications are going to be significant." "And Dr. Vell?" Fenn paused. "That's a separate matter. The federal investigation concerns the security breach and the network access. Dr. Vell's conduct in relation to the protocol dismissal and the performance notice against you is a matter for the state medical board and the hospital's internal governance." She said it carefully, the way attorneys say things when they are not telling you what they think the outcome will be, but are making sure you understand where the levers are. Abigail stood. Her ankle registered the weight shift and she accepted it. "Is there anything else you need from me tonight?" she asked. "Not tonight. We'll need you available tomorrow for follow-up questions." Fenn looked at her. "One more thing. The 2 individuals recovered from the compound outbuilding. The woman has asked to speak with you. She says she has information that she'll only provide directly to you." Abigail looked at her. "What kind of information?" "She wouldn't say. She said you'd understand why when you heard it." Fenn's expression was precise and unreadable. She said to tell you, the message on the strip wasn't the first one. The corridor was quiet. Where is she? Abigail said. Federal Medical Unit, East Parking Lot. Agent Decker can take you. She followed Decker down the corridor and through the hospital's main lobby, past the swept glass and the evidence markers, and the two federal agents doing documentation near the entrance, and out through the main doors into the evening air, which was still warm but had lost the punishing edge of the desert afternoon. The woman from the outbuilding was sitting in the back of a medical support vehicle with a blanket and an IV line, and the look of someone who was genuinely tired but had decided to stay awake for one more thing. She watched Abigail come across the parking lot, and when Abigail climbed into the vehicle and sat across from her, she said without preamble, "My name is Petra Wills. I worked for the Second Network for 3 years before I understood what it actually was." She held Abigail's gaze. "I've been trying to find a way out for 8 months. The compound was the closest I'd gotten to people who might be able to help." She paused. "I was the one who sent you the message on the strip." Abigail looked at her. "I sent you 3 before that," Petra said. "You didn't have the number yet. They were sent to the hospital's general system, flagged as administrative communications. You wouldn't have known they were from me." She looked at her IV line, then back up. "But you acted on them. The supply cabinet, the protocol revision, the access logs you pulled on the security rotation." Her eyes were steady. "You acted on information you didn't know I'd sent, because it was the right thing to do regardless." Abigail was very still. "The Second Network," she said. "Has a list," Petra said. "Not the same one as the First Network. A different list. And it's not a targeting list." She paused, and what came next landed in the medical vehicle like something that changed the air pressure. "It's a list of people inside federal agencies, people with access, people who've been providing information to the network for years." She looked at Abigail directly. "And one of the names on that list is someone inside the task force that's currently running this investigation." Abigail sat with that sentence for 3 full seconds. Not because she needed time to understand it. She understood it immediately, the way you understand certain things when you've been in enough rooms where the wrong person was listening. A cold, specific recognition that arrived without surprise and without panic, just the flat, settling weight of a thing confirmed. She looked at Petra Wills, at the IV line, at the blanket, at the woman who had spent 8 months trying to find an exit from something she'd walked into before she understood what it was. Petra was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has said the most important sentence of the last year of her life and is waiting to see what it lands on. "Who?" Abigail said. "I only have a designation, a position, not a name." Petra's voice was steady, but her hands weren't entirely. There was a slight tremor in the one resting on her knee that she wasn't trying to hide. "Senior coordination role, access to case architecture and personnel assignments. The network has been using that access to stay ahead of the federal mapping effort for at least 14 months. 14 months again. The same number. The same window in which Pollard had sent her name east, in which the access reporting had begun, in which the entire operation had been building toward one morning in a hospital in Dustin Creek. "The list," Abigail said. "Do you have it, or do you know where it is?" "It was in the compound, different room from the drive your people recovered." Petra paused. "I'm telling you this because I don't know who in that building I can trust with it, and because you moved on information I gave you without knowing where it came from, which means you make decisions based on whether information is right, not based on who's sanctioned to give it." That was a fair read. Abigail didn't dispute it. "Decker," she said. Not a question. She was working through the logic of who in the current structure she had enough read on to trust with this, and Decker had been consistent all day in ways she could verify against observable facts. Young, clean in his reactions, no lag between what he said and what he did that would indicate a secondary calculation running. "I don't know, Decker," Petra said. "I do, marginally, but enough." She looked at Petra. "Fenn?" "She arrived after I was taken into custody. I have no read on her." Harwick. "Military, not federal. The network's penetration appears to be agency-specific." Petra looked at her carefully. "The designation suggests someone in the task force coordination structure, not field personnel. Harwick's chain runs differently." Abigail stood. Her ankle pushed back and she accepted that. She put her hand briefly on the edge of the vehicle doorframe. "I need you to tell this to Harwick directly. Not through the task force channel. Not through Fenn's documentation chain until we know which part of it is clean. She looked at Petra. Can you do that? Petra looked at the IV line, at the medical tech who was on the far side of the vehicle doing equipment checks with the professional disregard of someone trained not to listen. She looked at Abigail. Yes, she said. Abigail went to find Harwick. She found him at the command vehicle in the parking structure, which had been partially broken down but not fully. Harwick was the kind of man who didn't close a command post until he was certain the situation was settled, and nothing about today had given him that certainty. I was looking at the map display when she came in, at the regional markers and the compound position and the airstrip she had reached by going over a ridge alone, and he turned when he heard her. She told him in under 4 minutes. She gave him Petra's designation, the second list, the penetration of the task force coordination structure, and her assessment of the trust architecture as she currently understood it. She told him she thought Decker was clean, and she thought the military chain was outside the network's access, and she thought Fenn's documentation was at risk if the penetration was at coordination level. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, not processing. She could tell the difference, and this was the stillness of someone who has just had a piece of information slot into a gap they had been carrying around for months. 8 months, he said. That's what Petra said. 8 months of watching the federal mapping effort stay one step behind. We thought it was operational security on their end, clean tradecraft. He looked at the map. It wasn't tradecraft. They had a reading position. Yes. He looked at her. The second list, if it's in the compound, my people are in there right now doing evidence collection. They need to be looking for a secondary storage location, not in the north room. Petra said different room. Her read is that it was kept separate from the personnel targeting list deliberately. Different sensitivity level. Different handling. Harwick was already on a secure channel. His own, the military one, not the task force frequency. Talking to the compound team in the flat, precise cadence of someone redirecting a search without explaining why over an open line. She listened to enough of it to confirm he had understood and moved correctly. And then she stepped back out of the command vehicle and stood in the parking structure in the fluorescent half-dark. The parking structure smelled like exhaust and concrete and the faint chemical residue of the military vehicles that had been staged there all day. Through the open side of the structure, she could see the hospital's exterior, the lights of the news crews still set up beyond the perimeter tape, the federal presence at the entrance, the upper floors where the ICU windows were lit with the ordinary light of a working medical unit. She had been awake for 19 hours. The ankle was a sustained complaint. The bruise on her forearm from the supply room in the cardiac unit had developed fully and was a deep specific purple that she'd seen when she'd pushed her sleeve up in the debriefing. Her left shoulder had a tension in it from the 2 hours of rifle work that was going to become a real problem by morning. None of that was the part that was heavy. The heavy part was simpler and harder to name. It was the gap between what she had known about herself and what this day had required her to show. 4 years of quiet. 4 years of being Abigail Marsh, ER nurse, unremarkable and slow and not worth anyone's attention. 4 years of a life that had been small in exactly the ways she had needed it to be small, and that had also, and this was the part she hadn't expected, become real in ways that mattered. Tamsin's charting, Herman Price's crossword puzzles, Kelsey Perry handing her a 20 gauge with shaking hands, the protocol in the binder that had kept a man breathing while the building was on fire. She had gone into that hospital as a person hiding. She had not noticed, until today, how much of it she had stopped hiding from. The compound team found the second list 40 minutes later, behind a false panel in the facility's electrical room. Not digital, physical, which was unexpected, and which Harwick said, when he told her, probably explained why the federal technical team's intercepts had never picked up any reference to it. Physical documentation doesn't transmit. Physical documentation doesn't get flagged by signals monitoring. Physical documentation is carried by a person, which meant it only moved when the network decided to move it, and the network had been trying to move it today via a plane on an unmapped airstrip. The list was 11 pages. Harwick read her the relevant summary over the secure channel. The task force penetration was a senior coordinating analyst named Brian Selton, who had been with the Federal Intelligence Structure for 16 years and had been assigned to the network mapping project from its beginning 8 months ago. He had access to every piece of analytical work the task force had produced, every source designation, every operational plan. He had known about the approach to the Soren Basin compound before the team moved. He had known about the strike team's composition and timeline. He had not known about Abigail going over the ridge alone. That was the one piece that had happened outside any channel he was monitoring, which was why the principal had been on the ground instead of airborne when Harwick's aerial asset arrived. The gap in Selton's picture had been her. Harwick coordinated Selton's arrest through the Inspector General's office, which was outside the task force's chain, and Selton was taken into custody at the Phoenix field office at 11:47 that night while he was still filing his incident report on the day's events. He had not known it was coming. He had been 40 minutes from submitting documentation that would have shaped the official record of the operation in ways that, Harwick told her later, would have been very difficult to unpick after the fact. 40 minutes. She thought about that for a while. The hospital board met the following morning in the administrator's conference room, which had been returned to civilian function overnight. Abigail was not at the meeting. She was in the ER, working a half shift at Tamsin's specific and somewhat forceful request, because 3 of the regular day shift nurses had been too shaken by the previous day's events to come in, and the department was short-staffed and patients did not stop needing care because the building had been a federal crime scene yesterday. She worked with her ankle wrapped and her shoulder making itself known every time she reached across a bed, and she triaged a broken wrist from a construction accident and a 7-year-old with an asthma flare and 2 separate cases of chest pain that required monitoring, and she did all of it with the same methodical attention she brought to every shift because that was how it had always worked. The work was the work regardless of what the building had been through. She heard about the board meeting in pieces, the way you hear about things when you're on a floor and information filters in from staff who pass through. Gareth Pollard had been formally terminated, pending prosecution. The security contractor arrangement had been suspended immediately pending audit. The board had voted unanimously to commission an independent external review of the hospital's security and administrative protocols. The scope of the review including every gap Abigail had documented in her protocol proposal, and several more that the federal investigation had surfaced. And Marcus Vell. Vell had presented himself to the board meeting voluntarily. She heard this from one of the surgical residents who had been in the corridor outside and heard pieces of it through the conference room door. He had presented his own account of the protocol dismissal and the performance notice and the safety meeting where he had overruled the generator lag documentation. He had not, apparently, minimized any of it. He had laid it out with the flat precision of a man doing the thing he found hardest because it was the right thing to do, which she had not entirely expected from him, and which the resident relayed to her with the slightly stunned expression of someone watching their understanding of a person get revised in real time. The board had placed him on administrative leave pending a formal review. His surgical privileges were temporarily suspended during the process. The state medical board had been notified, which was protocol for adverse event reviews of this scope, and what came next was not in the board's hands. She heard this while charting between patients, standing at the nursing station, and she sat with it for a moment. Not with satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction felt like the wrong word for an outcome that had been preventable and hadn't been. More like the particular gravity of watching something catch up to itself. The gap between action and consequence is not always as long as it feels, and sometimes it closes in ways that are neither theatrical nor clean, just true. Tamsin came to the station at mid-morning and stood beside her and looked at the same chart she was looking at. "Board meeting's done," Tamsin said. "I heard." "Pollard's out." "I heard that too." A pause. Tamsin adjusted something on the counter that didn't need adjusting. "There's going to be a lot of process. Reviews, audits, the legal side of things?" "Yes." "It's going to be a difficult few months for the department." "Probably." Tamsin looked at her. "Are you staying?" Abigail looked at the chart. She thought about the question, which was a real question that deserved a real answer. She had spent 4 years building something small and quiet, and it had turned out to be less hidden than she'd thought, and less small than she'd noticed. Herman Price's crossword puzzles, Kelsey Perry's hand steadying, the protocol in the binder. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest, "but not because I want to leave." Tamsin nodded once, as though that was the answer she had actually been asking about. 3 days after the attack, Abigail met with Harwick in a federal building in Phoenix, a neutral space, not his command structure and not the task forces, because the task force was in the early stages of an internal investigation that required careful management of who was talking to whom. Fenn was there, which had been Harwick's call. He had assessed Fenn as clean, his read based on the same kind of observable fact methodology Abigail used, and she trusted that assessment. Petra Wills was not there, but her formal cooperation agreement with the federal attorney's office had been signed 2 days earlier, and the information she'd provided was already reshaping the investigation's architecture in ways that Selton's access had been preventing for 8 months. Harwick told her the status in the same direct, no-buffer way he had communicated everything else. The principal from the airstrip, whose name was Edvard Sorn, which she had not known until now, was in federal custody and had retained a legal team, which meant the process would be long. The charges were substantial: conspiracy, terrorism, kidnapping, the hospital attack, the compound's activities, the network's 11 years of operations. Selton faced separate charges for his role: espionage, obstruction, conspiracy, and his cooperation was being assessed, though Fenn said his cooperation was not expected to be extensive. Rosalind Vance had agreed to cooperate fully. Her attorney had negotiated the terms, and what she was providing was filling in the operational timeline of the network's access to Harlow Valley in significant detail. Abigail had asked once what Rosalind's stated reason had been, why, after 6 years in that hospital, she had started feeding access information to a network she had to have known was dangerous. The answer, relayed through Fenn in the flat language of documented testimony, had been money in the beginning, and then fear, and then the particular trap that forms when you've done something you can't take back, and the people who know about it use that knowledge to keep you doing more. It was not a story that excused anything. It was a story that was human and terrible and not difficult to understand, which was its own kind of weight. Gareth Pollard had not cooperated. His attorneys were contesting everything, which Fenn said was his right and also was not going to change the outcome given the volume of email documentation and the testimony already assembled. The second network, Sorn's organization's parallel partner, the one that had received the partial transmission from the mezzanine device, had been the subject of rapid federal action in the 72 hours since the list was recovered. 4 individuals named on the list as domestic network contacts had been taken into custody across 3 states. International partners had been notified. The full scope of what had been operating for however long was still being mapped, but the architecture was exposed and the people who had been depending on Selton to keep them ahead of the mapping effort no longer had that protection. Sorn had said, on the airstrip, "This doesn't end here." He wasn't entirely wrong. These things are never entirely finished. There are always threads, always people who weren't in any room when the rooms were cleared. But ending and dismantling are different things. And what was true now was that the specific machine that had been built to find her and find the others on that list had been dismantled. Methodically, piece by piece, starting with a 17-minute gap in a security rotation on a Tuesday morning that a quiet nurse had noticed and not let go of. Harwick looked at her across the table in the neutral federal room. "The Department of Defense is formally recognizing your contribution to this operation," he said. "That's in process. The paperwork takes time, but Harwick, Colonel Harwick, is not wrong about that timeline." "I wasn't asking about recognition," she said. "I know, I'm telling you anyway." He paused. "There's something else. The personnel list from the compound. The targeting list, not Selton's list. It had 47 names. Former operations personnel living under civilian identities. People like you, in the way the man on the mezzanine used the phrase. I know what he meant. We've made contact with 39 of the 47. Some of them were living under cover they believed was intact, with no idea a targeting list existed." He looked at the table, then back up. "The process of notifying those individuals and assessing their security situations is going to take time. The federal structure for it is not organized in a way that accounts for what those people actually need, what the transition looks like, how to assess risk, how to rebuild cover if necessary, how to communicate with people who have been specifically trained not to trust official channels." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to go back to operational work," he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult on a structure for it, what it needs to look like, how it needs to function to actually serve the people on that list." Abigail looked at the window. Outside, Phoenix in November was warm and clear, the kind of day that looked like nothing had happened anywhere. As a nurse, she said, not as whatever I was before. As whatever you actually are, Harwick said, which is apparently both. She sat with that. It was the first time in 4 years that someone had said both out loud, and meant it as something other than a contradiction. I want the protocol gaps at Harlow Valley addressed first, she said. The board is committed to an external review. I want to submit formal documentation of every safety issue I flagged that wasn't actioned, for the record. Not for the lawsuit. I'm not interested in a lawsuit. For the record, so the next person who brings something like that forward has a documented precedent that shows it was real. That's your call to make, Harwick said. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. I know. I'm telling you because I need time to do it before I take on anything else. He nodded. How much time? She thought about the protocol documentation, about the board review and the state medical board process, and the audit that was going to turn up everything she had been tracking for 3 months. About Tamsin, who had asked if she was staying. 30 days, she said. 30 days, he said. And the ankle? She looked at him. Suarez filed a field report, he said, with the slightly too neutral expression of a man who is not quite managing to hide that he finds something mildly amusing. She was thorough. The ankle is fine, Abigail said. It was not entirely fine, but it was getting there. The formal documentation took 3 weeks, not 30 days. She submitted 12 pages to the hospital board's external review commission. Every safety meeting, every protocol proposal, every documented instance of flagged concerns that had not been actioned, with the clinical outcomes attached for context. Herman Price's record was in there, with his presenting vent dependency and the manual backup interval she had set specifically for him, and the pressure event on the day of the attack that Tamsin had caught and managed using that protocol. She did not editorialize. She stated facts and attached records and let the clinical reality speak in its own language, which is the only language hospital governance actually listens to long-term. She also wrote a separate document, shorter, not for the commission, not for any official process, that she gave to Tamsin. It was a comprehensive update to the ICU's emergency protocol, the version that should have existed a year ago, built on everything she had learned from the 3 months of preparation and the single day that had required all of it. Tamsin read it at the nursing station while Abigail was charting beside her, and when she finished, she put it down and was quiet for a moment. I'm submitting this to the safety committee, Tamsin said. It should go through the proper channel this time. It should have gone through the proper channel the first time, Tamsin said. That wasn't on you. She didn't answer that. Some things didn't need answering. Vel's board review concluded at the end of the 3rd week. She wasn't present for it and didn't ask for a summary. She found out the outcome the same way she found out most things at Harlow Valley, from the floor, from the staff who had been there long enough to have their own investment in what happened. His surgical privileges were reinstated with conditions, a required safety course, a formal co-review process for any department-level protocol decisions, and a mandatory documentation trail for all performance management actions against nursing staff. The state medical board had reviewed the protocol dismissal and issued a formal citation, not a license suspension, but a citation that was part of his permanent record. She heard this from a second-year resident who told her in the break room with the careful tone of someone who isn't sure how the person they're telling will receive it. She received it without visible reaction, because the outcome wasn't what she had wanted specifically. She had not wanted Vel destroyed. She had wanted the system that had let him dismiss a patient safety issue without consequence to have a consequence, and that was what had happened. It was imperfect and incomplete, and it was real, which is the most that institutional accountability generally manages. She also heard, from the same resident, that Vel had stopped correcting nurses in public. The residents had noticed. They were noticing a lot of things that had been normal enough to be invisible before, and the process of noticing was doing something to the floor's dynamics that was slow and incremental and probably more durable than any single disciplinary outcome. That mattered more than she let herself say out loud. On the 22nd day, she went to see Herman Price. He had been transferred out of the ICU to a step-down unit 12 days after the attack, which was a better trajectory than his admission had predicted, and he was waiting for a discharge planning meeting with his cardiologist when she knocked on his room door and put her head in. He was doing a crossword puzzle. Paper, the folded newspaper kind. His daughter was in the chair by the window with her shoes off and a cup of coffee, and she looked up when Abigail came in. "Nurse Marsh," Price said. He had the specific warmth of a man who had been told, at some point in the last 3 weeks, what had happened in the ICU on the day the building was on fire, and who had thought about it long enough to settle into something other than acute gratitude, something quieter and more considered. "Just checking in," she said. "You look better than the last time I saw you." "I was unconscious the last time you saw me," he said. "I hope I'm an improvement." His daughter was looking at her with an expression that Abigail didn't entirely know how to receive. It was the expression of someone who wants to say something that they're not sure language is adequate for. She didn't try to preempt it. She let it land. "Thank you," the daughter said, simply, without building it into something larger. Abigail looked at Price, at the crossword, at the cup of coffee on the windowsill. "Finish the puzzle," she said. He laughed, a short, real laugh, and went back to it. She walked back down the corridor to the ER and went back to work. The Department of Defense recognition came through on a Thursday afternoon in December, which was an ordinary Thursday in every respect, except that Colonel Harwick called her at noon to tell her the formal process had completed and to give her the option of a public ceremony or a private documentation. She took the private documentation. This was not modesty, and it was not false humility. It was the same practical calculation she had been making for 4 years, which was that visibility was a liability, except that the calculation was starting to feel different now. Not because the liability had disappeared, but because the reasons for managing it had shifted. It was not the same hiding. She was not the same person hiding. She was still working through what that meant when she went to the Harwick debrief 2 days later, not the formal military one, which had concluded 3 weeks prior, but the working session he had asked for, to begin laying out the structure for the consultation he'd proposed. She came in with 40 pages of notes. He looked at the notes and then at her. 30 days, he said. I had time in the evenings. The ankle? Better, she said, and this time it was true. They worked for 3 hours. What she had built in 40 pages was not a program. It was a framework for a program, built on what she knew from both sides of the experience, which was the thing no one currently doing this work had. The clinical side of what it means to reintegrate into a civilian identity, the specific stressors, the cover maintenance, the ways that threat assessment becomes involuntary and ongoing and difficult to turn off, and the operational side of what those 47 people on the list actually needed, which was not formal notifications through official channels, but a human point of contact who understood what they were navigating and who they had reason to trust. She was not building it for herself. She was building it because Harwick was right that it needed to exist, and because she was one of a small number of people who understood why it didn't yet. At the end of the session, Harwick looked at the framework summary she had printed on the last page. You put the clinical components first, he said. The clinical components are the foundation. If the person is not stable and safe in their immediate environment, the security assessment is secondary. Most of the people in the room that built programs like this would have put security first. Most of the people in the room that built programs like this were not nurses, she said. He looked at her. For a moment, in the way he occasionally did, he allowed something like respect to be visible in an expression that usually kept it further back. No, he said, they weren't. She went back to Dustin Creek that evening. She drove the 2 hours from Phoenix with the window down and the radio off, through the desert that had been the setting for the worst and strangest day of her adult life, which had also turned out to be the day that ended 4 years of waiting for something she had not been able to name precisely. What she had been waiting for, she understood now, was not safety. She had believed that the quiet life and the invisible performance and the 4 years of careful smallness were about safety. They were not. They were about not knowing what to be when the thing you had been built for was no longer something you were willing to do, and when the thing you had found in its place was still being assembled. The hospital had assembled it. Not by being kind to her, it hadn't been, but by being the specific demanding daily context in which she had discovered that the two things she was, the two things Harwick had said out loud in the federal building, were not opposites. A person who had been trained to save lives under the most extreme conditions was also a person who could save lives in a place with fluorescent lights and compliance paperwork and a chief of surgery who called her by the wrong name. Both of those people were the same person. She had needed the hospital to show her that, and the hospital had done it in the hardest possible way, which was the only way it could have been convincing. She drove into Dustin Creek as the sun went down. The town lit amber and ordinary in the early December evening. She parked in the hospital lot out of habit, though she wasn't working tonight, and sat for a moment with the engine off. She thought about Petra Wills, who had left 3 messages through a hospital's administrative system for a nurse she had never met, betting that the right person would act on information they didn't know they had received. That had required a specific kind of trust, not personal trust, but the trust you extend toward someone whose decisions you've been watching and whose quality of judgment you've assessed from a distance, without their knowledge. Petra had been watching her for 8 months. She had made a calculation about Abigail's character based on observable evidence, and she had been right. That was the part that stayed. Not the operation, not the network, not the airstrip or the ridge, or the 11 years it had taken to reach the airstrip. The part that stayed was a woman in a compound outbuilding who had decided that Abigail Marsh was the kind of person worth betting on, based on a protocol revision and a supply cabinet and a set of access logs reviewed quietly on overnight shifts. The quiet work. The work that no one had given her credit for, that Vel had dismissed, that had been invisible to everyone except the person running the inventory of a stranger's character from 8 months away. It had mattered. Not because it had been seen, but because it had been real. Real things have weight whether anyone is watching or not, and weight accumulates, and eventually it moves something. She thought that was the truest thing she knew. It was also the hardest thing to hold on to in the middle of a shift, when someone was calling you by the wrong name, and the corridor smelled like cleaning solution, and the charting was 3 hours behind, and none of it felt like it mattered at all. It mattered. The work was the thing. Do the work anyway. She got out of the car and went inside. Tamsin was at the nursing station, end of evening shift, finishing charting with the particular focused efficiency of someone in the last 20 minutes before handoff. She looked up when Abigail came through the door and took in the fact that she wasn't in scrubs and made the correct assessment. Not working tonight? No, just checking the board. Tamsin looked at her for a moment. Herman Price was discharged this afternoon. I know. I called his cardiologist. Of course you did. Tamsin's expression was the specific one that people get when they are deciding not to make a joke. She went back to her charting. The commission submitted their interim report today. Board is meeting next week on the protocol revisions. All 12? 11 confirmed, 1 under further review. A pause. Yours are in there. Abigail stood at the counter and looked at the board. The patient flow board, the tracking system, the names and rooms and status indicators that were the actual texture of the work on any given evening. 2 of the rooms on the board were the same patients she had triaged 8 days ago, still in the system, still needing follow-up. That was how hospitals worked. The building had been a federal crime scene on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday the patients had still needed care, and that continuity was not heartless. It was the whole point. The work did not stop being the work because extraordinary things had happened in the hallways. She made a note on one of the follow-up files that the attending needed to look at, left it in the system where it would be seen, and said goodnight to Tamsin. She drove home. She made food, actual food, not the protein bars and forgotten coffee she had been surviving on for the better part of a month. And she ate it at her table in the apartment that had furniture, but was starting to have other things too. A library book she was reading and had left face down on the couch, a pair of running shoes she had bought before the ankle that she was planning to use again in January, a plant on the windowsill that she had bought at a gas station 6 weeks ago on an impulse and had not yet killed. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that accumulate when a person stops living as though they might have to leave at any moment. She was not that person anymore. She had not left. She did not intend to leave. The plant on the windowsill was alive, and she had watered it twice, and it had developed a new leaf since she brought it home that she had not noticed until tonight because she had been, lately, a little distracted. She noticed it now. Small and green and new, growing toward the window without drama, without announcement, without waiting for permission. She sat at her table in the quiet apartment and looked at the new leaf for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and began writing the formal submission for Harwick's consultation framework, because the 47 people on the personnel list were real people in real places who had done real work and deserved a real structure, and someone had to build it, and she was the person who was going to. Not because she had been asked, not because she had been ordered, because the work needed to be done, and she understood it, and she was here, and those 3 things together had always been enough of a reason. The night was quiet. The plant on the windowsill was alive. She kept writing.